without further ado, Andrew Chung and Priscilla Liu, why don't you come up, please? So while Priscilla and Andrew are coming up, we're going to make this fast-paced and informal, but I want to just tell you what a treat it is to hear these two folks. I have the privilege of having gotten to know them a decent bit over the past couple of years, and Priscilla is at DWS, formerly Deutsche Asset Management, and Andrew is at 1955 Capital, not 1950 Capital. Andrew has a long history in venture capital. Priscilla has a long history in innovation, having worked for many years at Bell Labs, having done a startup of her own in technology, in telecommunications. And so what we have here are two people whose business is investing and turning a profit in precisely the area we're going to talk about tonight, but from very different ends of that area. Andrew from the VC area, Priscilla from an area that, as she'll talk to you about, is welcoming in large-scale corporate investment. So I'm going to shut up in a second, but I want to say one thing by way of framing. The title of the conference that's coming up September 4th through 6th in Yunnan is Green Grows Up, Forging a New Environmental Consensus. So we hope you think that's a catchy title, but more to the point, we hope you think that that's a substantively important title. And what I want us to talk about this evening is not the kind of grand notion of discovering that sustainability is important, because I sort of think that we as a world are beyond that. I think what's really interesting, because this is what you do every day and interesting to this crowd and interesting to a publication like Fortune, is the extent to which we're moving beyond discovery to the kind of mucking about, the messiness of how the hell to make money at it. And that's what I'd like to talk about, because I think the premise is, first of all, you're all interested in making money, and second of all, the environment is not going to benefit if people can't figure out how to make money along the way. Let me just say one last thing. There's a dichotomy that's in front of us right now, and that is, on the one hand, as you've heard earlier, there's increasing excitement on the corporate level about investing in these areas. I think it's fair to say that if you believe the polls, that there's a dawning sense among the public around the world that climate change is happening in a way that they believe they can feel. That is on the one hand. And on the other hand, let's be clear about where we are in terms of climate change. Scientists tell us that global emissions need to go to zero by 2050, and global emissions in 2017 and in 2018 not only did not go down significantly, they actually went up. So let's be very clear about what we are and are not doing. And last point before we jump in here is that we stand here at a conference that's talking, among other things, about the relationship between the United States and China on sustainability. And we sit here in the United States today on the first day of trade talks between the United States and China, which according to news accounts were rocky. And we'll talk about that because the way that those kind of political discussions go has an effect on the business of sustainability. So I've yacked on enough. Let me do this. Let's go deep for a second into what the two of you actually do every day. And I want you each to talk in very specific sense about a couple of deals. So Andrew, let's start, Priscilla, with you. So Priscilla, tell us about two $300 million funds that you're involved in at DWS. Tell us briefly about the difference between the two and the sorts of players that are jumping in and why.
Well, first, I think that I want to say that green is the new, is the new black, right? And everybody is now looking at sustainability and climate-related impact investments as well as opportunities as really the right thing to do. And of course, there is the question of, well, how do you make money? And my focus right now is China. And China, because of the financing that's available and because of the policies that are supporting it, and also because of the culture, is really becoming a very important as well as a very significant opportunity for investment that gives good return. And I think that in China it's unique primarily because of what the government is doing in supporting it. And what the government is doing in supporting this is primarily in providing financing that's available by encouraging the banks to provide the lending to green industries that are making a difference to the environment, but also because they have policies that encourages transparency, disclosure going forward, as well as really accountability for the large corporations. And then last but not least, and I always say this is more subtle, but it's critically important, is really the culture and the promotion and the government really encouraging a sense of responsibility and accountability. One of the things that kind of strike me is that you see a lot of the, you can say, PR that the government is putting out. And just a couple of months ago, when you go through Beijing International Airport, as you go through the gate, you've got these plaques that says, if you can't reuse it, refuse it. And I think that a mindset of the society is very important, and setting the tone so that accountability and responsibility becomes important is important.
So let me interrupt 1 second about these two funds. You have one fund in which Apple is investing a lot of money in renewable energy projects in China, and you have another fund in which Western corporates are investing a lot of money. Tell us about the Western corporate fund, because I think that may be a little more esoteric for this audience.
Well, the Deutsche Bank Asset Management has clients, and the clients are in Europe as well as elsewhere in the world. And these clients really are very interested in the rapid development that's going on in China in this space. And so, of course, the funds take advantage of the opportunities and look at specific sectors that are interesting, that are giving good returns in private equity for companies that are doing well, growing fast, and require growth capital for them to be able to scale and expand. And so these funds are really looking at the opportunities, but more importantly, measurable impact or metrics that could then be reported to the investors.
Because they're facing heat from the government in China actually to show results.
It's both. It's that, as well as really the corporations feeling a sense of responsibility, very similar to what we just heard from the Levi's CEO, which is really a culture of accountability. And I think that largely, when you look at these very large corporations, by setting the culture and the accountability for that, the ability to measure and then be able to account for what its company is impacting with respect to energy usage, water consumption, waste that is being produced, by being able to measure those, then you are able to control and actually be more efficient about managing those resources.
So Andrew, I want to ask you two questions. One is, I want to ask you, if I understand correctly, your investment thesis for many years has been precisely about the relationship between the United States and China, has been precisely about the trajectory of innovation in China, and yet there's been a real evolution in both of those things. So talk for 30 seconds about why this is the investment thesis that you've decided to spend a good portion of your life on. And then I want to ask you about one deal, and let's do it in 2 minutes.
Life story in 2 minutes. Well, I've been in venture for 15 years now, spending first 5 starting the sustainability practice at Lightspeed. I was a general partner at Khosla Ventures for 5 years, helping to lead the sustainability effort there. And one of the things that I observed during my time at Khosla Ventures was that very, very few of the technology companies that we had backed were very globally minded. The goal was to raise money in the US, partner with local utilities, work with local state governments or perhaps the national government to try to get into market in the US. And frankly, many of the companies really hit up against a wall and weren't able to successfully scale up their technologies or get that level of attention. When I started to bring some of the CEOs to different parts of the world, not just China, but different parts of China, Anhui province, none to Yunnan, but to Beijing, Shanghai, many of the companies found an audience that they had never seen before. People that recognized that there was a survival-driven demand to be able to address the environmental or sustainability issue, and folks that had capital sources that were backed by corporates and the government. And so we were able to successfully help more than 10 of our portfolio companies build bridges to China, to Southeast Asia, and to some extent the Middle East and Africa, where the demand was survival-driven and there was a very interesting dynamic force pulling the technology to these different parts of the world. And so fast forward to 2016, I was fortunate to announce that I launched 1955 Capital. It was the largest new fund announced in Q1 of 2016, which I think surprised a lot of people because this was the time where you want to invest in the next Snapchat or the next Airbnb or the next Salesforce. Very few people were looking at sustainability, but yet, because of the momentum around this global technology need to address sustainability issues, we were able to get investment support to be able to back this type of cross-border.
Okay, so I'm going to stop you. And we'll, if we have time to come back to the actual deal, we'll come back to an actual deal. But I'm looking at the clock, and we have just under 10 minutes left, and there's so much to talk about. So you've just heard the happy stuff. You've heard that, and I don't mean to denigrate it, you've heard that corporations are really increasingly interested in sustainability, both for reasons of reputation and reasons of governmental pressure. You've heard that there is a realization in the venture community that if you do this right, you can not lose your shirt but actually make money. And yet, if you look at, as I said at the outset, where the world is in terms of carbon emissions, it's nowhere near where scientists say the world needs to be. And more specifically, if you take the thesis that there is an integration between China and the United States and that integration is crucial to solving these problems, I mean, tell me if I'm wrong, but deal flow is slowing down, not speeding up, right? I mean, what is happening in terms of deal flow, and why is it happening? To what extent is it trade tensions? To what extent is it something else? Andrew, jump in first.
So after I announced my fund in 2016 with no more affiliation to Lightspeed or Khosla, 1955 being a brand new entity, we got more deal flow in that 2-year period than I could have ever.
And what about since then?
Since then, the same. Because what has happened is the need to partner outside the US has not changed. For a lot of the entrepreneurs and the CEOs out there, they are still thinking that China is an important market, Indonesia, Malaysia, elsewhere outside of the US is important, but yet there are government barriers that are being put in place
by the United States.
By the United States to slow down capital flows.
Yeah, and are you seeing the results of that in your book?
So I see the results of that in a lot of the different cross-border venture firms really slowing down their activity because a lot of what the administration has put into place has made it difficult for them to operate.
The US administration.
Right. What has been fortunate with 1955 is that we set up our firm as a US investment firm, US nationals running the company, and so we operate much like any other Silicon Valley firm. It just so happens that our DNA has been with that experience. So what has happened is we've actually gotten a swell of deal flow from a lot of the entrepreneurs that are still thinking about how can I partner in Indonesia, China, or Malaysia, and where do we go for that type of help? So
okay, I'm going to stop you. I want to start. Forgive me, but there's not enough time. So Priscilla, you've talked about the corporates piling on in a $300 million fund that DWS has. What are you seeing in terms of how easy it is to get money from these corporates? What the impact of the current political situation is? To what extent any of that's changing?
So our clients are for DWS, which is by and large, Deutsche Bank. Is global, so it's not just US. And so there has always been a much more proactive stance from the European sovereign funds as well as pension funds and other institutional European large institutional investors being very aware of ESG. And so as a result, since Deutsche Bank has had more than 20 years of history investing in this space, we have a lot of clients that come to us for investment in this area. And of course, China is really kind of the leader in the world now in this area of being very proactive in funding and supporting with policy and financing in this climate-related industry and infrastructure.
And but how is that changing? Is there any change in the last 12 months?
So there is. I mean, one of the things at the macro level, the statistics or the data that has been announced is that there's been a drop in terms of direct investment from China into US by 80%. And so it's significant compared to a year ago.
And that is why?
Because of policy.
Because of US policy.
Because of US policy and also because of the appetite. I mean, from the viewpoint of Chinese funds that are looking to invest outside, US had been, in 2016, getting over $25 billion of investment into US, money coming from China into US. Okay, and now it's dropped down to Last year, in 2018, almost 5 billion, or even less. If you look at technology, it's dropped down to 3 billion, okay? And so that's a significant shrink in terms of appetite, if you will. And so what's really driving that? Well, because they know that it's going to be difficult to get approval, and as a result, people shy away from it. And so where's the money going? Well, the money is going elsewhere. The money is going to Europe, it's going to Israel, it's going to other places where there are other countries who would be more than willing to get that funding to support whatever investment interest there is.
So I want to shift for a second in the slightly less than 5 minutes we have left. We're going to make two shifts, this one and one more, if we have time. So I want to talk about what the motivation is for the investors in the United States or in Europe or other Western countries to engage with China. I mean, clearly a motivation is the market, and I think we can sort of accept that and then push that aside. To what extent is there more than just the market as a motivation? To what extent is there either a kind of money that's coming out of China that's particularly attractive? And more to the point, to what extent is there innovation that is more than simply the ability to manufacture things cheaply, but innovation of the sort that would be regarded within 20 miles of this hotel room as innovation?
Well, I think that there is a ground shift that is happening in places like China, where the developing world has such desperate need for the technology that it creates, in Silicon Valley terms, a Netscape moment for a lot of these industries that in the US alone are difficult. So one example is in the food technology area, sustainable food. Everyone has been talking about the Beyond Meat IPO, which was the most successful IPO issuance since 2000. If you look at China, the African swine flu has just dramatically affected their food supply. There were 450 million hogs that were part of the pork population in China. 150 to 200 million are estimated to be affected by the flu. That compares to fewer than 150 million hogs that are in all of the United States. So if you think about the scale of the problem for the fastest growing middle class on the planet, they have an epidemic on their hands. And the question is, how can you address that? So from the vantage point of a venture capitalist and entrepreneurs, there absolutely is the idea of building technology that can address the issue around sustainability. But if you look at that specific acute problem, technology companies like Impossible Foods, Sustainable Bioproducts, our biggest deal to date, these are companies that are working on new food technology companies that countries like China may have no choice but to start working with in order to address the fundamental issue.
So this is really interesting, and Pat Brown, can someone get a microphone to Pat Brown, please? I didn't tell Pat that we were going to call on him, but we're going to put him on the spot. Pat Brown, CEO of Impossible Foods, is here, and by the way, will be with us in Yunnan, so that's worth the price of admission. But Andrew makes a really important point, right? Which is that to the extent that people are buying Impossible burgers today because they're the kinds of people who can afford to shop at Whole Foods or something, perhaps that will change if your choice of buying a conventional kind of a burger no longer is a healthful choice for reasons of immediate sickness. So in 30 seconds, Pat Brown, just tell us about your China plans.
Oh, brilliant. Okay. For a number of years now, actually, since I talked at the Ag Department in China's food security conference, one thing that I realized is that China's biggest national security issue, and someone can correct me if I'm wrong, is they are completely import dependent for a critical part of their food supply. They do not have food sovereignty because they are using animals to produce meat. And the technology we've developed is so much more land and water efficient, which, China has the lowest arable land, lowest
And so what are you going to do in China?
What we want to do is basically go to China, talk to the policymakers in China and say, we want to help you solve your biggest problem.
What do you need the policymakers to do to let you help them?
Because we don't want to wait to kind of incrementally do this over decades. We want to say, we will transfer our technology to you under any kind of fair terms that will enable you to produce all the meat your country demands using your own farmland and your own water supply, which, based on our water efficiency and land efficiency, is absolutely doable. And we want to work with you. We don't want to rip you off and make a ton of money. We don't want to get our pockets picked either. but we want this to be a win-win partnership with you, and
Okay.
we're ready to deal.
So I apologize, Pat, I'm being really unfair to everyone here, but this is why you should come to Yunnan, because you'll hear much more about these plans and about the context within which they exist. So we have 11 seconds, and I may give you one more minute. So this is a lightning round, and Pat Brown brought us to the question of policy. So let's actually address policy for a second. And here's the first question of two last questions. Priscilla, we start with you. You have President Trump in front of you. 15 seconds, what do you tell him about the subject of sustainability?
Well, I can say this much. I can say that China is advancing and moving so fast and so responsive with respect to what is really objectives are in addressing environment impact issues, that I think they will be innovative not only from a technology viewpoint, which is the fear that Trump has of transfer of technology, but they are far more active in being innovative with policies, with support, with implementation, with sheer persistence. And I think that if you look at the ultra-high voltage wires that has been laid out, which is now more than 30,000 kilometers of it, which is the same amount of high-speed rail, by the way.
State Grid, by the way,
Right,
is
by
one of the global innovators.
Right, exactly. That kind of innovation isn't technology alone. It is innovation with respect to perseverance, implementation, operation, financing, as well as financial.
So what you tell Trump is open your eyes.
Open your eyes, because it isn't just what is obvious.
Okay, and Andrew, 15 seconds really, what do you tell Trump?
Let's make a deal.
Let's make it, okay, seriously. Yeah, and the next sentence is?
I would make it a business proposition. Beyond Meat IPO, massive acute issue in China, and you can pick your sector, energy, food, agriculture, health, and present it as an incredible arbitrage opportunity where the United States, which has developed such incredible technology, if you find the right way to partner with markets like China and every other country out there, there's an ability for the U.S. to develop this leadership position across each one of these sectors that is unparalleled.
Okay, so I'm getting the evil eye. I'm going to give you each 15 more seconds.
I want to interrupt.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'll cede you a minute, because while you three were sitting up there, the story came across the wire saying that the tariffs on $200 billion of products will go into place tomorrow morning, and I just think they will go into place 1 hour from now. And maybe we should use those last 11 seconds.
Let's get him on the phone.
Those last 11 seconds that you've been eating up for the last 3 minutes.
Excellent.
To comment on that.
Yeah, good.
So I always think that this trade issue is overblown, because if you look at it, the trade issue, the difference is 410 billion, right, in terms of right now the deficit. And if you look at the economies of the two countries, one is 21 trillion, the other was 14 trillion. So going back to answering Trump, China's GDP will overtake the US. That's inevitable. It's only a question whether, how many decades? Is it 2 decades from now, or is it 3 decades? And it's not a question of who's better. It's just because China has 3 times or 4 times more people than US. And so as a result, that even growing at even 5% per year in terms of GDP growth, China will take over, will become the largest economy in the world. And if you look at the GDP growth today, China represents close to 40% of the world's GDP growth, which means that if we choose to impose tariff, that negative relationship is only going to hurt the US.
Andrew, you want to jump in?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I think that a lot of the tariff battle, unfortunately for us, is a larger scale negotiation, a lot of parrying tactics where the victims are the American people and the Chinese people. But they are parrying tactics. And I'm reminded of a conversation that I was fortunate to have with Madeleine Albright, former Secretary of State, over dinner shortly before I started 1955 Capital, where she said that in her study of history, there have never been 2 nations more codependent than the United States and China. So we better not mess this up. She used a much more colorful metaphor, but I think that part of the thing that many folks are missing, I think, in this whole discussion is that for many thousands of years in history, China was the greatest superpower, and there is a reversion to the mean that is happening now after a very difficult time for them from the 40s to the 60s. And the world needs to catch up with that notion. The world needs to understand that in history, they are a big player, and you need to figure out how to work with them in an appropriate way. And in my belief, technology is where we have such a strong advantage in so many of these sectors that are important to them, that if we don't invest and instead we close off, it's going to give an opportunity to China and other countries to work on it on their own, and guess what? They're moving really quickly.
Okay, that's the last word. The last question was going to be, what do you say to Xi Jinping? But you have to come to Yunnan to hear the answer. Thank you guys very much.
All right, thank you.